Hi, everyone. Britt here. In this week's episode, we have another amazing interview for you, but we wanted to give you a heads up beforehand that it might have a little bit of a trigger warning. This week, we talk with Ash Baker, an amazing therapist practicing in North Carolina, about the topics of eating disorders, disordered eating, and disordered exercise. Let me tell you that this interview was so amazing to speak with Ash about all these topics. And I wish we had more time to speak with her because the answers we got to all our questions are just so well put together and thoughtful. All of Ash's social media information is located in the description below if you want to follow her on social. But also check out her podcast, I Married Your Therapist, located wherever you get your podcasts. So sit back, sign up, and enjoy this week's episode of Race to Wellness.
Hi, I'm Heather, a certified personal trainer, yoga instructor, and have my BS in exercise science and behavioral coaching from Arizona State University. I currently live in Oregon with my 3 kids, who I will reference often.
And I'm Britt, a former Division I collegiate athlete turned recreational triathlete and fitness instructor. I have a degree in exercise biology from UC Davis, and I currently live in Belgium with my husband and 4 kids.
Together, we're best friends wanting to bring the world of health and fitness back to a more grounded and balanced place that's accessible to everyone.
Each episode, we're going to talk about ways to live out a well-rounded and healthy life that makes sense in today's modern, busy world. We'll cover topics related to exercise, nutrition, mindset, mental health, competition, and so much more.
So sit back,
Sign up.
and let's get ready to race to wellness.
Well, like most therapists, I grew up in a home that was really traumatizing. And so I really wondered why those things happened. And I guess in some ways, my mom was a nurse, and I loved how that was like part of who she was. It wasn't just a job that she had, but also like she would connect with strangers and like be helpful to them. And I loved that about her. I knew that maybe medicine wasn't for me, but I wanted something where I was engaging with people in a really personal way. And then as I got into school and studied psychology, it just felt really natural to me. I loved that. And then my first job out of college was working in a counseling center. And it was the most amazing place. I was just like a front desk receptionist, but I loved what was happening and the way that they talked about things and understood things. And so that kind of became what I pursued. When I first went to grad school, I actually thought that I would be working in eating disorders. I had had an internship there and adored it. And then that became not what I was specializing in. I started working in a sexual assault resource center and studied trauma. And that became a big focus. And now that I'm practicing, I've really kind of moved into working with neurodivergent folks. So autism, ADHD, OCD. I learned that I was autistic, and it is such an exciting overlap of those things to be working with autism, but also trauma and a lot with the LGBTQ plus community. So it's kind of transformed over time, but I love getting to be a therapist. It's really like the best job in the world. It's such a happy place for me to be.
And I don't think that I know, where are you based out of?
Yeah, I'm in North Carolina, and with therapy, you can only see clients in the state that you're licensed in. So
Okay.
we're working on that, but I see people just in North Carolina, but virtually, so all over NC.
Okay.
Very cool. I bet just being, so now that you do a lot with like neurodivergence and all of that, and the fact that social media is like boosting this topic and this whole, I don't want to call it a culture because it's not a culture, but like they're boosting this platform of you might be ADHD if you have these signs and all of this. I bet that shapes a lot of the people that you see, or like it makes the conversations a little bit different than they would have been 20 years ago.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Our understanding, I mean, even recently, of like what autism is and what ADHD is has been so narrow and has been this one view of it. And to get such an explosion of people talking about it and showing diverse experiences, I think has been great. I think that, immediately the concern when something like that happens is, oh, will too many people identify this way? Like, will too many people do this? But honestly, it's been great. And when I'm working with younger clients, like, I'll say, tell me what TikTok diagnosed you with. Like, tell me what's happening on
Mm,
your For You page. And it's been a great way, I mean, to have so much exposure to normalize it, that like, yeah, it's just a difference in the way your brain functions. All of our brains function differently. This is one type of difference, but there are so many like strengths and beautiful things about your brain and about the way you exist in the world. And there are other people out there like you, because so many people, I mean, they're having these experiences over the course of their life, but they think that something's broken with them. And it's like, no,
mhm.
there's something so powerful and good about the way that your brain works. It just doesn't fit into this very like neurotypical view.
Mhm. I think there's such a difference. So when I was in high school, I remember a friend of mine, I won't name him, but I remember a friend of mine had been diagnosed with ADHD, and it was my first time experiencing something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that he felt very like outside of the
Oh
social norms
yeah.
and group and that kind of stuff at that age. And now thinking about like, according to TikTok and according to those videos and stuff, I definitely have some tendencies toward ADHD, which
Yes.
I think that like I feel a certain sort of way because of my previous experiences with how people were diagnosed and
Absolutely.
then what they went through. And so I have a hard time being like, maybe I do have ADHD. And then at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, like so many people experience it and there's nothing wrong with it. Like it's just, it
Yeah.
is how our brain functions and that's okay. And you just find ways to build patterns and behaviors around it that work for your life. And that's okay.
Yep. Yeah, yeah, and there are so many amazing strengths to an ADHD brain. I definitely had that experience around autism where I knew people who were autistic
Hmm.
growing up in school, and they fit that stereotypical autistic, because that's how they got the diagnosis. That was the only way to
Hmm.
get a diagnosis at the time, was to be in this very strict kind of box.
Yeah.
And so knowing what that was, I never considered that for myself. And then when I did start considering that for myself, there's been so much stigma around it and what that means, that it was like a lot of imposter syndrome around
Hmm.
that. And then also a lot of avoidance of wanting to take up space in something that's supposed to look a certain way. And if I don't fit that mold,
Yeah.
is it okay for me to talk about this, to talk about my experiences there? So, yeah, a lot
Yeah.
to learn, a lot to unlearn.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really important point that a lot of people kind of suffer with is that idea of imposter syndrome. We just did a podcast about it. But in
Oh,
addition to
nice.
that, like, am I autistic enough? Am I ADHD enough to
Yes.
be part of that group? And it's like, there's not, it's a spectrum. Like, everything
Yep.
within that is acceptable. And it's not, you don't have to be enough. You are enough right now.
Yeah. Absolutely. And your voice is so needed just as it is, because this is one
Hmm.
representation of this. And there are going to be so many other people out there with a similar experience who also don't feel like they're allowed to be a part of this group. And
Hmm.
it's a gift to the world when you like are able to show that side of yourself if it's something you want to do and are comfortable with. Yeah. I love
Yeah.
that.
I feel like I can personally relate to this whole do I fit into this box of like, am I enough of this thing to be able
Yeah.
to
Hmm.
call myself this? Because I have friends who have been diagnosed with eating disorders or
Mm-hmm.
have grown up with disordered eating patterns, etc., for basically their whole life. And so it's almost become part of their identity of
Hmm.
Yes.
who they were. And when I look at
Mm-hmm.
myself, I know that there were times in my life when I have had this, but I have not been always a disordered eating person, or I have not
Mm-hmm.
been always anorexic or always bulimic. Um,
Hmm.
and so, whenever the eating disorder week comes around, the eating disorder awareness week,
Yep.
I never share anything about my story because I don't feel
Mm-hmm.
like if I were to say anything online that it's enough to be like, oh,
Yes.
yes, I struggled with this. But did I really
Hmm.
struggle with it enough because this person had to go to treatment or this person
Right.
was so far along in their issues that their family had to get involved? Whereas
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
I did not have that issue. This wasn't something that needed to
Yeah.
be clinically helped with.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and
Oh,
you even talked about prior to this was that your mom probably isn't aware that you even experience these things. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
this is going to be a moment.
Yeah. And that is That's a big deal because that's the most common experience with disordered eating, is that what we tend to hear about is somebody who had that, like, went off to treatment and had their family involved and had all of those things happen for them. But the truth is that the vast majority of people who experience disordered eating are never going to get that sort of support or recognition. They're never going to have the people in their life know, and it is something that they're going to feel isolated in. And it's really important that, like, not only is your experience valid, but it's the most common way that people experience that, and that getting to share that is really important. That, like, if you experience it at that level, you're not alone. That's how so many people encounter that. Not to mention feeling like you don't have enough of disordered eating to be qualified in that category exists all throughout people who experience eating disorders. That we had a dear friend who was dying in a treatment center and really, really struggling, who was still saying, I'm not bad like some of these people here. I don't know that I fit into this group. It's a hallmark trait of dealing with that.
Yeah.
No, I'm glad that you were getting to share and talk about that. I think it's really important that disordered eating is going to look a lot of different ways, and that most people who experience it will have one more like yours.
Yeah. That kind of leads into the next question that we had for you, was around what are some factors that lead to disordered thoughts around food and exercise?
So I think that a lot of this is just going to be comparison.
Sure.
There's so much discussion around, like, fad dieting and around weight loss that's just so common and normalized in our culture that you're going to be hearing about those things all throughout your life, and you're not seeing the fact that most diets won't work for people, that most of those things actually cause all sorts of other issues, or that people won't be able to stick with them because they're unrealistic. And keeping in mind that people are profiting off of selling you that idea, that always somebody is making money off of you hating yourself. And so there is, you are being targeted with people wanting you to feel that way. The other thing too, that's a big deal now and always has been. I mean, I remember when I was younger, the conversation around eating disorders was always like seeing magazines. But now with social media, we are so constantly inundated with people who look a certain way, but we're not getting the behind the scenes of that. We don't know what went into making that picture possible. We don't know what else is happening. And comparison is always going to be at the root of how we start having those thoughts.
Yeah. We literally just talked about, Heather wants to kind of discuss the topic in a video of before and after pictures, and how for some people that feels really icky. Like, this is my before picture, and talking about what you looked like before, making it almost associated with a negative feeling.
Right. This is inherently less worthy than this coveted, like, after photo.
Exactly. And I see both sides of it, because I also see the type of people who maybe they did a couch to 5K for the very first time, and they want to post their before picture of when they first started, and then their after picture of when they finished their 5K. And it's a wonderful thing. It maybe has nothing to do with weight loss and had everything to do with they accomplished this goal.
Oh, yeah. And that's the other thing, is like social media is all about sharing like our human and individual experiences. And that's amazing. But keeping in mind that you as a human have a whole life and a whole story, and that everybody else on there does too. And that it's never fair to look at that person who went through that experience and to try to make that your own, or to think that that means something about you inherently. But yeah, there are a lot of good uses for a before and after photo like that.
Yeah. I had two really interesting ones, because I'm not currently a parent. Let's preface that. And so I do not have any personal experience to draw from, except for having been a child at some point.
Right.
And so growing up, a lot of how at least my generation was raised, and generations prior to me, is you sit at the dinner table and you eat the food that's put in front of you, and you don't get to leave until you've eaten this food.
Yep.
And people would sit at the dinner table for hours, and there'd be the standoff of kids and adults of who's going to break first. And so I'm wondering, like, as a therapist, and probably having worked with people who may have very traumatic experiences with
Yeah.
eating and food and
Yep. Clean your
parenting,
plate.
etc. Exactly.
Mhm.
What like kind of goes into like, is this a trigger factor of like, does this maybe help bring this down the road of, do you have issues with food later in life
Yeah.
of when your parent tells you that?
I definitely think that that can lead to issues. It's important to know about kids that kids are very egocentric,
Mhm.
not specifically selfish, but egocentric, meaning that how they're learning to understand the world means that their brain has to think that their environment has to do with them. It's about them
Yeah.
noticing that their impact on the world around them, and knowing that they have something to do with it, that they have a place in things. And they're also overgeneralizing things. So if my family does this one thing, all families do these things, so that they're
Mm.
learning, in a broad sense.
Mm-hmm.
When kids are punished, when kids are told that something that they're doing is wrong, they are always going to take that personally, and it's going to turn into, there's something wrong with me. And so that sense of shame goes really deep, and that sense of shame is always attached with trauma. And so when you have a situation like, you have to clean your plate, you have to finish the food in front of you have to know that, like, anytime there's a situation with that intense sort of pressure, how deeply that's impacting somebody and how
Mhm.
much that's triggering all of these things. And it's because a healthy kid's brain is meant to do those things. It is meant
Yeah.
to be egocentric. It is meant to view the world as all about them, but they're never going to view their parents as the ones who are wrong. They're going to view, if I can't do this thing that I'm supposed to do, there's something deeply wrong with me. And so,
Mm.
yeah, I've certainly seen clients who, they're definitely learning the world through their parents. And when there's all this pressure to finish what's in front of them, how personally they take that and how much that lives with them and how much shame they might have around that moving forward.
Mm.
Whether that's always continuing to do that for the rest of their life and feeling a lot of pressure around it, or not doing it but feeling shame, and that it's going to lead to a really deep sense of like who they are and what that means about them as a human. But yeah, I think that in general, forcing a kid to sit there and finish their plate, one, kids are really, really good at listening to their bodies in a way that adults
Mhm.
no longer are, because of how many times
Yeah.
we've been told not to do that. And the fact that kids are so good at listening to their bodies means that, like, when a kid is done eating, it's that can be safe. Like, that's okay for them to be listening to their bodies. And in fact, what a great lesson to be teaching them, to be listening to their bodies instead of a lesson about obedience, which is what we're teaching them when we tell them
Mm.
to finish their plate, which is, don't listen to your hunger cues, don't listen to that feeling of being full, listen to me. You don't know your body, I do.
Mm.
That's a really terrible lesson to teach a kid long term, not to listen
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
themselves and what they need. And I think a lot of our struggle with eating and with things in relationships and all of that comes down to being told not to listen to ourselves.
Yeah.
So that's certainly a result.
I know that that's something that like my mom, so she talks a lot about her childhood and her eating, and that was
Uh-huh.
something that she was always forced to eat whatever was on her plate, and her parents
Mhm.
were heavy, and so they had, the portion size was huge, and so as an
Yeah.
adult she talks about her food addictions that she feels like she has, and things like, she specifically talked about her mom would eat all of their remaining Halloween candy, all of the chocolate out of their Halloween
Mhm.
basket. And so as an adult, chocolate, like if she gets chocolate, she won't just eat one piece of it. She will eat all of the chocolate for fear that
Yes.
someone is going to take it from her.
Oh, yeah.
And so, yeah, so as an adult, like seeing her go through those experiences and sharing with me how they've been, I had a very different upbringing. I don't ever remember my parents making me eat everything that was on my plate. And so
Mhm.
my children don't experience that. My children, I'm probably on the farther side of it where I'm almost too lenient with them about what they can eat. And I just say,
Mhm.
like, trust your body. I'm very open to trust your body, listen to your signals.
Yeah.
How did that make you feel? And I know that it's hard for some people to understand when they see the things that my kids are eating, but understanding that, like, in the long term, they're learning to trust themselves through that process.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think we get so many messages from our parents, and this is what I see a lot in people who struggled with disordered eating habits, is messages about food being good or bad. And then there's a
Hmm.
lot of shame around that bad food. And we can't make good, thoughtful decisions around something that we have shame with. It's just going to
Yeah.
mess with our processing. So viewing all food as good and allowed. The other thing is
Hmm.
that our brains are meant to seek out categories of food that we don't eat. Like it's important that we have sugar. It's important that we have carbs. It's
Hmm.
important that we have all of these things. And when you totally cut it out, your brain has to hyperfixate on it. That's its job.
Yeah.
And yeah, so you're creating this environment where you have shame around it. So you can't make good and thoughtful decisions. And your body is biologically forcing you to go seek that thing out
Yeah.
because it's scarce in your environment. I think that parents really do worry about, well, where am I falling on the side of being too lenient now? But the fact
Hmm.
that your kids get to grow up trusting themselves and also
Hmm.
like just believing that they know how to make good decisions,
Yeah.
that's another thing that comes along with a lot of disordered eating is like just such a lack of trust in yourself to be able to do
Yeah.
that and seeking out that control through being really rigid in the decisions that
Yeah.
you make.
Yeah. Well, and I know like from my childhood, one of the things that was not allowed in my house was that we weren't allowed to have candy at all. And so
Mhm.
I remember a group of my cousins were allowed to have all the candy that they wanted in the world. And so I felt very restricted. And so as a
Yeah.
teenager, I wanted candy all the time. And it was something that like that was what I was going to.
Yep.
So now my kids, the way that I experience it with them is that I allow them to have the sugar. I allow
Mhm.
them to have as much sugar as they would like. And the thing is that they learn through that process because they've
Yep.
gone through it in their own bodies of I ate too much sugar and I felt so sick afterwards. And
Yes.
then they're like, I never want to do that again. And so they moderate for themselves and they know what that feels like in their own
Yeah.
body. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. No, and when you have been like denied something for so long, you are now dealing with an onslaught of so many like happy chemicals when you do
Hmm.
get that thing, that like
Yeah.
scarce, rare thing. How are you supposed to overcome that and listen to yourself well?
Hmm.
Not to mention any like pain that you're experiencing from overindulging is going to get
Hmm.
tied right in with that shame, which is going to continue to feed that cycle. When yeah, your kiddos are getting to try it and learn the natural consequence of that experience and go, oh,
Hmm.
I get to enjoy this thing and there's nothing wrong with it. But when I have so much of it, it impacts me.
Hmm.
I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
All right. The other trigger that I have, that
Yeah.
I don't have personally, but that I'm questioning about. So when I used to live in Oregon, and we
Hmm.
had some neighbors who had, I want to say they had 6 kids. So they had a lot of youngins under their roof. And we
Hmm.
would notice that one of their punishments when they were doing whatever was wrong was they'd have to come outside into the green paths between all the houses and they'd have to run
Uh-huh.
laps.
Yep.
Mm.
And at first, like when I just look at it at face value, I'm like, great, you're making them go outside and you're making them go run around, get that
Yeah.
energy out, do it.
Hmm.
And as I started to like think about it more, I don't know if
Hmm.
I'm over analyzing this or if I'm like digging into something like I'm brilliant now, but probably not. Anyways, I started to think about like you are you now associating running and exercise with this is a punishment? And so
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
will later in life these as they grow up, these kids start to think about exercise as a punishment for them because it's always been used that way.
That is such a good question, and what an interesting scenario that you were watching. Yeah, I can totally understand the motivation behind doing something like that with your kids. Like if they're rambunctious, if they're causing, issues in the house or whatever, like yeah, get them outside to run, get them outside to expend some of that energy. But yeah, I think you're right that having moving your body be the punishment for doing something is definitely going to start to associate that exercise isn't a nice thing that I get to engage in. It's not something that makes me feel good. It's not something that's intuitive. It's this thing I do because I do something wrong. And how many adults have that idea that like I've done something wrong by eating something I shouldn't, or that I've done this thing and exercise is my punishment. And it's going to prevent you from being able to ever have a healthy relationship with exercise. The other thing that's important for kids is that in general, childhood is the best time to be discovering that like happy, healthy relationship with exercise. And that exercise shouldn't be, it should come secondary to doing things that you love. What do you love doing? What's interesting to you? Is there a sport that's fun for you? Is there something that has you move your body that's fun and enjoyable? And exercise is the natural outcome of engaging in something that you enjoy and love. Instead of exercise, it's its own like standalone thing that must happen. That's important, because that's where I start with adults as well, where they'll view exercise as like this standalone thing that they do because they've been bad. And instead, like, in what way do you move your body that you enjoy getting to do? Or what space are you in that naturally involves movement that you enjoy being in? And that's where we really nurture like a happy, healthy relationship with exercise, is that it's secondary to a thing that we actually like.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a tough one. I definitely think though that there's, eating disorders and exercise disorders aren't going to develop in every single person who has an experience like that, for sure. That's so different across the board. But yeah, you really set yourself up for or your kiddos up for the potential to have a really unhealthy relationship with it when it's punishment, because that's what adults spend their whole life trying to undo, is exercise as punishment.
I feel the same way. This is slightly off topic, but I feel the same way about bedtimes. A lot of times parents will use going to bed as a punishment for their children.
Such a good point.
Yeah. And so I never used it. I was like, oh my gosh, you guys, we get to go to bed now. Like, we had such a good day. It was full of so much stuff. And now it's bedtime. And my kids have not always, there's definitely nights where they're like, we don't want to go to bed yet. But for the most part, they want to go to bed. They want to do it because it feels good in their body. And they know that they've done the activities for the day, that kind of stuff. But yeah, that idea, a lot of parents make it a punishment. And so then of course you're going to fight with them on it for every night for forever.
Yeah, you're going to try to avoid things that don't feel good to you. And when it's something that's not falling in with your body's natural rhythm, and it's not something you're allowed to enjoy, but something you have to do because you're supposed to, you're always going to want to rebel against that. And kids it's important for them for development to be like pushing boundaries and doing that. And when that bedtime routine is something that's like, it happens now, or it's a punishment, I think is a really tough one. My husband was laughing at me the other night. I was laying in bed and I giggled to myself and he's like, what are you thinking? And I was like, I just thought to myself, I sure do love sleeping. And I have such a healthy relationship with getting to go to sleep that it is something I get to do. Oh, it's so nice to like lay down at the end of a long day and to allow myself to go to sleep, and not something that I have to fight myself on. And I think that, that routine starts when you're a little kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, that's a really good example of that same thing, where when it's a punishment, not to mention that natural consequences are what's really best for kids learning things, that the natural consequence of having too much candy isn't you're bad, there's a punishment for this. The natural consequence of having too much candy is that you get a stomach ache. And that when our punishments are instead just like natural consequences, that's how we're really learning from things. And so to do something in the house and then the punishment is to go exercise, it's not going to be helpful for lesson in the first place. But that's not really going to be the mental link that your brain needs to be able to learn that. So it's not going to be helpful in the way that you hope that it'll be. So I think that when the punishment is something about, removing a food that they enjoy or sending them to bed or doing something, it's just not really good for kids' development in the first place. It doesn't really teach that in the way that we'd like for it to. That if you, that if you like hit your brother, that having this like unrelated consequence isn't really gonna help that behavior in general. That it needs to be something that comes directly out of that, which is needing to go like mend a relationship, which is tricky to do.
Yeah. And I want to be clear that I want to be clear that This isn't, in my brain when I think about it, this isn't the mom saying, you guys are getting too rambunctious in the house, go outside and like
Right.
do your stuff. This is more the mom
Yes.
says to you, or the dad or whoever it is says, you need to go outside now and do 20 laps of whatever this thing is, or you need to go outside and do 100 burpees and come back in.
Yes.
And that's where I was having this issue of like, this feels kind of icky.
Yes. Oh, exactly. Yeah, that I think that having rambunctious kids in the house, getting to say the house isn't a good place for running and screaming. Outside is a good place for running and
Yeah.
screaming. Let's move this party out to the yard is totally different and is
Yes.
totally appropriate compared to you hit your brother, now go do 20 burpees. Like that, those two things aren't linked. That doesn't make any sense. That's not how kids learn. And also, yeah, now moving your body is something that you hate to do. It's what you do when you're bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes me think of another story. My two older kids. So my oldest was just being a jerk to the middle one, and he was on and on for the whole day. And I was to the point where I was like, dude, I'm going to let it go. Like, I'm tired of having the conversation with you, and I'm going to let the natural consequences happen here. And he just continued on. And they went in the bedroom, and he came back out a minute later, and the middle one had punched him, stuck out his thumb and punched out his tooth. And he's covered in blood. And he was like, and I was like, I told you. And I'm like, to the other one, of course you can't hit him. That's not appropriate. However, you also need to learn that sometimes that's going to be the case. That's going to be what happens if you just won't let it go. Like, stop.
Yeah.
Like, you
But
can't just be a dick.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. But that sort of thing, ties in with natural consequences, which is what happens if you poke and poke and poke at somebody, that person might turn around and snap at you instead of this completely unrelated consequence that doesn't teach me the lesson. I'm still just as frustrated with my brother. Haven't learned a better way to navigate that situation. Haven't learned a better thing to do with that energy. I just have to like get rid of that energy somehow, which isn't natural to us.
Rather than having a conversation.
Right.
It's like we haven't had that since then, but my middle one, he was like, I
Bet you haven't
stuck
had it
out
since
my
then.
thumb. He was like, he knew that tooth was loose and he wanted to knock it out. He was like, all right, bud.
Oh, kids.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, goodness.
I think we've talked a lot about like kids at this stage and like developing them into like and giving them the best start of like adulthood and that. But a lot of our listeners are not going to be kids, and I'm sure that a lot of our listeners might not have children who they're trying to nurture this behavior with, and they're going to be someone who's now dealing with, they have
The consequences.
the consequences of either their upbringing or other factors in their life that like caused them to be in this state or didn't cause them to be in this state, and they see it in other people. And so I feel like it's important to kind of point out that this can start developing as a child, but it also could start developing later in life as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I would agree. I was going to say, I didn't experience disordered eating until I went through my divorce. It was a very specific time period where I am a type of person who, when I'm stressed, I don't eat. It's not a stressed eat person. And I remember that was the moment in my life where I was literally, it was like liquid diet. I was eating a juice or drinking a juice in the morning and doing 3 to 4 workouts a day or 2 to 3 workouts a day. And that was the time period that I experienced that in. But I think that there's so much that goes into someone getting to a point of disordered eating. So maybe speaking a little bit about what are those like signs and what are some other factors that could lead to disordered eating.
Yeah. That's such a good point, that it doesn't always develop in childhood, that you can have a healthy relationship with food and still develop something down the road. These things are always coming down to needing a sense of like power and control in your life, which we all need as humans. And so a lot of the times it is a situation like that where you go through a big experience, and maybe the natural outcome of that, maybe there's absolutely no intention around eating less or exercising more. But as you start to find that sense of control coming back into your life through doing those things, or start to get compliments or start to have something change in your life that's really reinforcing that, again, we can then fall back on this, well, I can have an even greater sense of control in my life Like we all need control in our life. We do need that. I think a lot of people will kind of shy away from, I'm not a controlling person, but like we need to know that the things that we do have an impact on ourselves and on the world around us. That's just a human experience. And so it's common to go through something like that. And for some of us, getting to a certain point um, with weight loss or with that control will then just naturally trigger kind of a genetic component in our brain that's making us much more likely to head down that path. And so somebody else might get to that same point and then have reduced stress and no longer be doing those things. And somebody might get to that point and then it doesn't matter about their level of stress, but that these things, it's kind of flipped that switch now, and those things are naturally happening. But either way, if you're starting to notice that that diet or exercise are taking up a lot of your thinking during your day, that it's taking up a significant portion of time during your day, now you're no longer in control of your life, right? Like now something else is starting to run your life for you, and it's no longer that thing that was benefiting you. My friend works in eating disorders, and the example that she always uses is the Grand Canyon. And so the Grand Canyon didn't just occur overnight. It was a long time of water, like etching out this path again and again and again. And when you're dealing with disordered thoughts around eating and or exercise, you're digging out a Grand Canyon. And by the time you look at it and notice what's going on, you probably have quite a canyon in front of you, and that it takes intentional time and effort to fill that back in. That you literally, when we think things, they are carving out paths in our brain, that our brain structure is changing over the habits that we have and the things that we do. And when you've gotten to the point that it takes up a lot of your time and energy, that you're exercising and trying to eat a certain way, you've already started carving out that canyon. And so rather than saying, I need to get to a certain point, that this is something that I'm just starting to notice, so it's probably too early to need to do anything, that the more time that you spend in that, the more of that Grand Canyon you're digging out. And that actually from the moment you're noticing that, that's exactly the time to start addressing it.
Yeah.
Because it takes a long time to develop, an eating disorder. It takes a long time to develop something that's gone that far down that path. And it's going to take that much longer to be able to deal with. So the moment you start noticing, hey, I think that this is like starting to run my life, that's exactly the time to be reaching out for help and support.
Yeah. Well, and it can be really hard to notice those patterns. Like in the moment, it was something that I didn't realize that it was happening. I was just seeking out, to your point about control. I wanted to have some aspect of my life that I could control in that moment because everything felt like chaos and struggle. And it was the endorphins from the exercise and from controlling what I was eating was a huge. But yeah, we talk a lot about noticing the patterns and the thoughts in our brain, like acknowledging them, just taking time to spend with your thoughts and almost like stepping back from them and just noticing what they are, like that those thoughts are coming in and we're experiencing them, but rather than always allowing the emotional process to happen, just noticing what the words are, what the phrases are, what those patterns are.
Yeah. Oh, it's so important to be able to take a step kind of outside of or back from your own brain and to just notice what's happening in there. What are the patterns of thoughts that are occurring or of actions that are occurring, and to be able to just kind of assess. And that's a big part of what counseling is in general, is just having somebody help you with that outside perspective of stepping back and going, wow, I'm hearing this thing again and again and again as a thread throughout your life. What's the connection of these things? It can be hard to notice the patterns in our own brain.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that I lived at my parents' house. So for anyone who doesn't know the story, I now live in Belgium. And it took a while to get here. And so I moved during the pandemic. And because of that, I had to get a visa in order to enter the country. And it took a very long time to get that. So I moved with my parents for 8 months. And looking back on it now, it's very clear what was happening. But in the moment, I had no idea. And it was that I had lost control of literally everything in my life. I am now living in my parents' house. I am now moving to a country where I don't speak their language. I am quitting my job as soon as I get my feet. Like everything is falling, quote unquote, falling apart. And so the one thing that or the two things that I could control was what I ate and the amount of exercise that I did. And so
Yep.
literally every day after work, I'd shut my laptop, I'd put my dog in his harness, and we would go run for an hour a day. And it would get to 6, 7 miles every day. And then I would come home
Mm-hmm.
and I would do my strength training workout after I ran. And then I would come upstairs and I would make my protein shake. And these are like, this is what happened every single day. And eventually my body gave up on me and I tore my calf muscle because I was doing too much and not listening to what was happening, because I had blocked all of that out, all of the like signs of you need to take a break
Mhm.
because this is what I need to do. It's the only thing I can control. And then as I'm rehabbing it at my parents' house, my mom kind of started to have this conversation with me that my parents were talking about me, which is really interesting to hear. But they were talking about me on like, they figured out that I was doing this to gain control well before I
Yeah.
did, but neither of them kind of breached it with me because they were nervous to have this conversation.
Sure.
And I feel like that's something that a lot of people can probably relate to, is something drastically changed in your life, whether it's a divorce or a move or a loved one dying, and you feel like your life is kind of happening without your control, and the only thing you can like hold on to and grasp is your nightly dinner and your run or your weightlifting routine, and that's the only thing, and you really grasp into it and you reach and you hold it really like tightly, and you don't want to give it up even when your body or your mind is telling you, no, we need a break.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a confusing one too, because I mean, of course, like moving your body like that and eating, changing up the way that you're eating can have a lot of really positive impacts on your mental health and on the way you feel about yourself and that relationship that you have with yourself. But yeah, it's when you start shutting that down that you're no longer listening to your body and the signals that it's giving you, that you're pushing yourself well past where those benefits are occurring, and it's become this thing that you have to do. I think if you're looking at the routines in your life, think about the things that feel like a rule now, that you have to do them, that it feels almost like there's some sort of consequence around not doing that. And it's usually a signal that something there is disordered. Like, we need flexibility in our routine. You need nights where you're not working out, where you're not pushing yourself to do those things. And when it's gotten to that point, and that's a good point as well about what happened with your parents, is that I think when it comes to disordered thoughts in general, we're almost always the last to know. We're almost always the last to notice when that's going on, because it feels like our lifeline. Like, that probably felt like the last thing in your life you take a good hard look at and see if it had a good place there, because it felt like the thing that was getting you through. And so when you're noticing that in a loved one, it is important to say something. I think that it can be an issue when we jump straight to letting our fear drive that. And so we're now coming across as really judgmental. But curiosity is a big deal. That being curious about your loved one's routines and what they're doing. When are they taking time to rest? What sort of flexibility do they have in their life and the way that they're eating and the way that they're moving their body can go a long way. They might not be noticing what's happening. Or maybe it starts with a conversation, not even checking in on those things directly, but just asking about their mental health and how they're coping with whatever big life thing. Something I talk a lot about with clients is that stress is stress, and it doesn't have to be like good stress and bad stress is all stress in our brains. And so sometimes it's a really exciting, good move in their life that's happening, that maybe even like the divorce was long awaited and that's a good change, or the move is exciting, or the new job, or the wedding, or whatever big deal thing. Like, stress is stress. And all of those things are going to open us up for the potential to have disorder thoughts start creeping in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that you pointed out that oftentimes we're the last person to know, because it's something that my mom said to me recently when I was like, oh my gosh, I think I was struggling with an eating disorder. And she said, oh yeah. And I was like, you didn't say anything. Like, this was years ago now. Well, and then in addition to that, like also like thinking about like, how terrible you feel in your own body in some of those moments
Mhm.
when you're exhausted and when you're not feeding yourself, and thinking, how did I push that aside and
Mhm.
continue down this path and not recognize it? Like, the
Yeah.
other pain that I was experiencing must have been so much worse than this pain that I'm
Yes.
causing
Yeah.
myself in order to continue down that path.
Oh, for sure. And our brains are so good at disconnecting from the things that are too much to feel at that time.
Mhm,
And it's meant to happen for like a short period of time. It's meant to be able to get through this one, like, survival sort of moment. But
mhm,
the fact of the matter is that sometimes we're stuck in those moments and that those moments last for a really long time. And it's a gift to us that our brains are so good at allowing us to just keep going when in moments like that. But yeah, it really opens us up to missing that something is going severely wrong
mhm,
with our body and how we're not listening to it, or how we're no longer tuning into those emotions, and that can become really extended. And yeah, we usually don't know, because the
mhm,
signals that we would be getting that tell us we've gotten to that point are also being shut off along with everything else. We can't push down on just one thing. We can't tap out negative emotions and keep positive things, and we can't
mhm,
push away symptoms that or signals that something's going wrong and listen to our body saying, okay, we're exercising too much. Like those things, if you're shutting it down, you're shutting it down. When that communication stops happening, it's just not happening. And so yeah, it's really normal to not notice, and we can get so much anxiety around approaching somebody that we care about when that's
yeah.
happening. But often they don't know. We can get really deep into something. Usually it takes some sort of crash in our life to go, oh
Yeah.
God, there's
Wow,
a
yeah.
lot happening.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I also think the other part of it, like that you've spoken to just recent or just a little bit ago, was the idea of the compliments in those
Mm,
periods. I remember
mhm.
that I was changing the shape of my body and I got so many compliments from so many people and attention and that kind
Yep.
of stuff. And I feel like that really like spurred it on, like, oh yeah, I'm doing the right thing because I'm looking this certain way. And
Yeah.
and that's not always healthy, especially through social media. If you're sharing your journey on social media at
Mhm.
all, people are quick to jump on there and give a compliment if you've drastically changed the way that you look, whether it's
Oh,
through
yeah.
healthy means or unhealthy means. Yeah.
Something I learned while dealing with this friend who is dealing with the eating disorder is that it's a rule in my life now that I just don't make body comments. That unless
Hmm.
maybe I'm like deeply, deeply aware of what's going on. So, like, if my husband has a certain weightlifting goal, maybe we'll make
Hmm.
a comment that's directly related to that one thing that he's working on. But in general, you do not know why somebody's body is changing.
Hmm.
And yeah, the way that we compliment somebody who's lost weight, but not other body changes,
Hmm.
really make that like there's one body that's more valuable than all of the rest of them. And we all feel that, and that's communicated to us in so many different ways, through social media, through advertisements, through the times that people will compliment us and when they won't.
Hmm.
And that body changes are basically always symptomatic of other things going on in our life,
Hmm.
and you don't know what those things are. There are a lot of reasons that people, you know, lose weight due to anxiety or stress or overexercise or all of those things. And like, it doesn't tell the full story. And commenting on that one like symptom is probably not helpful to somebody. And people were probably missing other signs of stress in your life to get to
Hmm.
that like compliment of the thing that we all think is most socially acceptable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The hard part with that too is the person commenting probably has great intentions.
Oh, sure.
Hmm.
They're probably there thinking that they're like, yes, I'm cheering you on. I'm really here to celebrate
Hmm.
you. But your
Hmm.
weight loss is caused mostly by your stress of your divorce. And so now you're thinking, oh, I didn't look as good when I was when I was married. Now I
Hmm.
look so much better and I'm going to keep going down this route. And so I guess, like, how then do you cheer someone on and like let them know like you're there for them without it coming across as like, oh, good for you for losing weight, now you're better,
Right.
like, because it
Hmm.
can still be something people are trying to do.
Sure.
And I guess for those people, you want to encourage them with their healthy journey and their healthy lifestyle,
Yep.
but not everybody is in that same route. You don't necessarily want to encourage the weight loss that's caused by not eating.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yes. That's so important. It's so tricky. I think that there are a couple of ways to avoid doing that. One is that, I have the firm rule against like body comments and that sort of thing. But definitely if I'm talking about a big change in somebody's life, if I'm going to make a comment about that, that needs to be somebody in my very close circle. Like just
Hmm.
commenting on people on the internet, commenting on an acquaintance that you haven't seen in forever who's had a big body change. This is probably not helpful. You have no idea what's going on in the background of their life. That's probably a space where you should just decide to stick to other things, that you can
Hmm.
say something about, their something about the way that they carry themselves, that they're glowing, that they're whatever, but making a body comment there is almost never going to be the appropriate response. That save that sort of acknowledgement of cheering somebody on for the people who you really know. You're really invested in their journey. You know what's driving this thing, the steps that they're taking, the way that that's being done. Those are the people who you're close to really cheer on in that way. And even then, make sure that's not the only thing you talk about. Make sure you are checking in about how they're feeling, about how their mental health is during that,
Hmm.
about if it's ever stressful to be doing this thing. What's it costing them to also be having this goal? Is the goal actually making them happier to be pursuing? And when you know all of those other details in somebody's life, yeah, it's great to cheer each other on when we've set a goal and we're achieving
Hmm.
it. But you should probably know the full story
Yeah.
before
Hmm.
that's somebody you're talking to. And if it's somebody you don't know the full story, it's really best to just stay away from that in general.
Hmm.
Love that.
It's tricky. We're so we're so like it's the go-to compliment for somebody is to talk about something like that. And it's tricky to work that out of your system. Like even me knowing why I made that decision to no longer make body comments and to see up close and personal the result that could have on somebody. It still takes a lot of unlearning because we get
Yeah.
we get so inundated with that all the time.
Yeah.
There's a video I think I saw, or somebody shared it with me about when criticizing someone or giving someone feedback on something, that there's a
Hmm.
5-second rule. So if they can't
Hmm.
change something in 5 seconds, then don't mention it. And I feel
Yes.
like that's something that you can use on the positive too. Like if
Yeah.
somebody's changed something in their body that's taken more than 5 seconds, like I wouldn't, like, unless
Yep.
there's very specific purpose behind it. Like
Right.
I'm working out so
Yeah.
that I can lift this much weight. Like, yes, compliment that. But
Yeah.
in general, just let it be.
Yep. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and focus on the outcomes of that. If,
Hmm.
somebody's posting a goal about being able to make it to a certain lift and they do that thing, congratulating them is great. But in general, making comments about a transformation in somebody's body, yeah, stick to the
Hmm.
5-second rule. I love that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Well, cool. I think that we've covered like a lot with
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
everything that we've gone through.
Yeah.
I kind of want to just close it with, do you have any advice for
Hmm.
people who maybe have now noticed that they might be going down this route, or people
Hmm.
who they know that they're kind of predispositioned towards this like
Yeah.
behavior? Do you have any advice for these people to kind of encourage them and let them know like it's okay, and maybe what to do if they start to notice any signs and symptoms?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, you're definitely not alone in that. And that, again, most people dealing with disordered eating or disordered thoughts around exercise are at the same point. That what we tend to see are these big, we love a good like transformation story. We love a big thing that where everybody was involved and it was this whole scenario. And we love
Hmm.
some drama. But in general, most people are at this point where they're just noticing something's off, that it started to take control of their life. And if you're noticing that, first of all, good for you. Again, like we talked
Hmm.
about, it is hard to notice that. It's hard to notice that something that has given us the sense of control might now be causing us harm. And then the next step is get other people involved. It's really helpful at that point to see a therapist, to see somebody who can help you examine those thoughts, but get friends and family involved too. So often when we're dealing with something that's a struggle to us, one of the main outcomes is that we're isolated. We feel like it's not something that we can talk about.
Yeah.
Great to tell all of your friends about your weight loss story. Way harder to tell your friends about, hey, here's what's been going along with that. That one of those conversations is really normalized. We have a script for, and we know that everybody gets to celebrate it and all of those things, but much less normalized to be able to have a conversation around the ways that we're struggling. And that oftentimes I hear when people are finally opening up, especially about this sort of thing with other people, that they didn't know they were surrounded by other people going through similar things or who had in the past. So many people are impacted by this. So you're not alone, and make sure that you're connecting with other people. That's what's going to help you get some outside perspective on your thoughts, and that you're connecting with people who in general are supportive of this and have an understanding of this. Like we've talked about, a lot of people have a really disordered mindset around this in general. So make sure that the supports in your life understand how painful it is to deal with these thoughts, how isolating it is, and that they're able to help direct you to some other resources. Yeah. And then the Grand Canyon thing, that the longer you stay in this, that there's no enough. That the lie of disordered thinking is that there's a point where it's going to make things perfect, so that we're going to get down the road and everything's going to have been fine and worthwhile. And that it's a lie that comes along with the disordered thinking. And so the sooner you get to acknowledge that, the sooner you get to start undigging that Grand Canyon and start filling it in with beliefs that actually help support what you're looking for.
Love it.
Yeah. Cool.
What?
Yeah. I'm so glad we got to talk about these things today, though. I think that so many people are touched by this. And again, it's so isolating that it's not something you can talk about, that there's great spaces to talk about, forums to talk about your weight loss or your lifting or whatever. And not a lot of space to say, I think this might be hurting me. I think something might be wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially because it might have started off really innocently. You
Yeah.
maybe started it off with, I just want to lose 5-10 pounds, or I just want to use exercise so I can start building strength. And then you see how much it's helping you, and then you add more and more and more to the point where you didn't notice that this actually started to harm you a little bit, because it started off great.
Yeah. All of the harmful things we do started off as coping. That everything that we do that's bad for us at some point worked for us. That we don't start things because we're intentionally causing that harm to ourselves. We start things because it helped in some way, even really extreme things. And so to forgive yourself for that's a path that we all walk, that we all get into something because it helps, and then it starts to cause us harm. So the important thing is that you're recognizing and that you're starting to reach out to support, and that you're not alone in that. There are so many people dealing with, again, something that started off helpful and ended up being harmful.
Love that. Thank you so much for coming to hang out with us today.
Thank you guys for inviting me to hang out with you. This has been so fun. I love what you guys do and the things that you talk about. This information's so important to get out there.
Awesome. Where can our listeners find you?
Yeah, people can find me on Instagram at therapywith_Ash. And then you can find the podcast on I Married Your Therapist on Instagram and on TikTok, which I'm experimenting with, and we'll see how that goes.
Fun.
Love it.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today at Race to Wellness. We hope you found it both fun and informative. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can visit savagehealthllc.com and make a donation on the Race to Wellness page. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our next episode.
We love hearing from you, so feel free to ask us any questions or leave us a comment down below. You can click on the links in the description to follow us on social media, or simply send us an email at racetowellness2023@gmail.com.